Hello everyone, my name is Nimah Bhura and my research topic is anti-Muslim sentiment in India and the Czech Republic, and my advisor is Professor Jan Kulik. So my central research question focuses on why some Hindu Indians and Czech Republic citizens display a hostility towards Muslims and partake in anti-Muslim sentiment and what effect that has on both groups. And so I approach my research in three parts. So first, I discuss the when, and in doing that, I try to identify specific points after which there have been increases in anti-Muslim sentiment within both countries. Then I discuss the why, and so I analyze why portions of each population are willing to partake in anti-Muslim sentiment. And lastly, I discuss the effects of that sentiment. So to my first point, I focus on critical points as they are defined by Laura Garcia Montoya and James Mahoney in their The Logic of Critical Event Analysis. And I use this definition to identify exactly when the scope or state of anti-Muslim sentiment in each country underwent a shift. And so in analyzing the critical points, I also analyze rhetoric of leaders following these events. And so in India, I identify that point to be the 2002 Godhra train burning. And this event was followed by vast rhetoric on the threat of Muslims, and specifically rhetoric of the chief minister of Gujarat, Modi, where he vilified and blamed Muslims for the event, despite there not being an official report citing them as the perpetrators of the train burning. And this incited and contributed to mass violence against Muslims and between Hindus and Muslims, which led to the Gujarat riots after the Godhra train burning. And in the Czech Republic, that critical point is the 2015 EU immigration quotas. And so the rhetoric following that event by President Zeman, emphasized the Muslim threat and emphasized the threat of Muslims to the security of the Czech Republic, and warned Czech Republic citizens of the effects and threats to their security and their country that would come of allowing Muslim immigrants into the country. And so we see that the Czech Republic undergoes shift in anti-Muslim sentiment or their perception of Muslims after this event. So before 2015, according to the data, 56% of Czech Republic citizens viewed Islamic fundamentalism as a threat. And after, 85% did. And so we see this jump in negative perception of Islam and Muslims by some Czech Republic citizens. And so while I recognize the effects of rhetoric and its characterization or its place as a contributing factor to anti-Muslim sentiment, I realize that it is still people and portions of the population that are willing to accept such rhetoric and willing to partake in anti-Muslim sentiment. And so that brings me to my second point, where I discuss the why. And so I try to identify why portions of these populations are inclined to accept leaders' rhetoric and are inclined to partake in anti-Muslim sentiment. And so I conclude that there must be an underlying hostility between the two groups, whether it's Muslims and Hindu Indians or Muslims and Czech Republic citizens, that has prompted this surge or this acceptance of anti-Muslim sentiment. And so in India, I identify that point, or the trigger or beginning of that hostility, to be the partition of India, where India was separated into India and Pakistan. And the main proponents of that split were Muslims. And so I find that because of Muslim support of the split between India and Pakistan, a lot of Hindu Indians distrust Muslims, whether it's Muslims that elected to move to Pakistan or whether it's Muslims that stayed in India. And so they harbor a lot of resentment and hostility towards Muslims for that split. And in the Czech Republic, well, the Czech Republic is a little bit more complex because of its limited exposure to and experience with Muslims. In Czech Republic, the population of Muslims is less than 1%. And so a lot of the times I find that the context of Muslims and the perception of Muslims within the Czech Republic is influenced by the perception of Muslims by Europe and European media. And so I identified the start or the trigger of this hostility to be the European response to 9/11. And after this point, there was an emphasis on the terrorist Muslim or the Muslim threat. And this label, if you will, was portrayed in media within Europe and emphasized in rhetoric within Europe. And so that kind of found its way to the Czech Republic and was embodied in their own media and their own rhetoric. And eventually it did influence the perception of Muslims by Czech Republic citizens. And so this brings me to my last point, which is radicalization. And so I try to understand what the effect of this hostility towards Muslims is. And so I discussed radicalization being that effect. And so I approach this in a series of steps. And that begins with anti-Muslim sentiment and the labeling of Muslims as terrorists. And that causes some Muslims to be isolated from society. However, I argue that this isolation is unnatural because people seek companionship and they have this desire for a community. And so I argue that some of these isolated individuals end up associating with those who have been similarly labeled as them, which are terrorists. And so they associate with terrorists not only because they feel like they have been or they share this label, but also they find comfort in finding similar cultural values and sometimes finding similar basic religious values in these groups. And so this association with terrorists makes them more susceptible to terrorist ideology. And so eventually, some who associate with these terrorists undergo this radicalization process. And this only increases the Muslim threat. And so the increase of the Muslim threat, of course, leads to an increase in anti-Muslim sentiment. And that prompts nationalist extremists and right-wing radicalism as well, which only increases anti-Muslim sentiment. And the process continues. And so we have this effect, or the result is this cycle of radicalization that starts with anti-Muslim sentiment and is continued by terrorism and extremism. And so in conclusion, I find that although India and the Czech Republic are vastly different in their experience with and exposure to Muslims, one of India's largest minorities are Muslims, while in the Czech Republic, the population of Muslims is less than 1%. But despite and given that difference, I find that they still fit this model that begins with a critical point that triggers the embodiment of underlying hostility between the two groups in the form of anti-Muslim sentiment, which leads to the effect or the results of radicalization of both parties. And so what may have begun as a fear of the Muslim threat or fear of Muslim radicalization or terrorism has actually resulted in the perpetuation of terrorism, the perpetuation of radicalization, and the perpetuation of violence. So to finally conclude, I think that the example of the Czech Republic and India show or display that what may begin as a fear of terrorism or hostility between two groups can backfire in that it can, instead of eliminating terrorism and eliminating violence or protecting oneself or one's country against it, it may actually lead to the perpetuation of violence and terrorism. And so with that, I will conclude my presentation, and thank you so much for listening.